of the Mental Health Professionals Network meeting for the Victorian Psychocardiology Network. I'm Dr. Lyndall Shand and I'm with the Australian Centre for Heart Health and I'm one of the coordinators of the network. So just to start off with, I'm just going to go through the structure of tonight briefly. So I'm going to introduce our chair, Professor Alan Jackson, our director from the Australian Centre for Heart Health, who will chair tonight's meeting. We'll hear our presenters and then there'll be some time for question and answer and discussion. And then at the end there's some refreshments, so please hang around and socialise and network and enjoy some of our food. Before we get started, I'd just like to respectfully acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge the people, the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered, and pay our respects to the elders past and present. So just a little bit about our network as well. There's a few familiar faces here who have been to past meetings and have even presented. So if you're new to our network, we are focused on integrating the psychology in heart disease with, so looking at the sort of psychological factors underlying behaviour change and adjustment to heart disease, as well as we want to focus on, in future meetings, on the link between acute mental health and cardiovascular disease. So we've got a future meeting coming up planned on that topic, so I'll give you more details at the end of tonight's meeting on our upcoming plans. And so far we've had about 250 people join our network, and on average we get around about 40 to 60, it fluctuates, attending our face-to-face meetings. So we're pretty pleased with how we're going, and we have some exciting meetings planned for the rest of the year. So now I'd like to just hand over to Professor Alan Jackson, who will kick off tonight's meeting.
I'll try these ones. Good. So welcome everybody on to the meeting, and I just want to also let people know that, as many of you will know, that the Australian Centre for Heart Health, formerly the Heart Research Centre, is one of the auspicing bodies of the network, along with Dr. Marley Zalvaranga from Monash. And I think it's a really great development, and I'm really pleased that we've been able to take part in the development of the Psychocardiology network. So, having mentioned Marley, so I'll actually say a little bit more about her as a co-editor of the book, and I'll say something about Don as the main speaker for tonight. Marley is currently a cardiac clinical psychologist at Monash Heart, an adjunct academic research fellow at Baker IDI Heart and Diabetes Institute, an adjunct senior lecturer in the School of Public Health at Monash University, and is in private practice at MediPsych Clinic. And she was an honorary senior research fellow in the Heart Research Centre. And as we've just recently undergone a restructure into the Australian Centre for Heart Health, where we're now putting people back into their roles as honorary staff members and scientific advisory committee members, but that's still in train. But Marley's will have a choice of roles when we get the structure finalised. Marley's undertaken research into the neurobiology of panic disorder and mechanisms of cardiac risk in panic disorder. So I'll now turn to Don and introduce Don to us, who's going to talk about the handbook. Can I just ask, before we go any further, are there any authors of chapters in the handbook here? Yeah. So some of us. Yeah. Good. Professor Don Byrne graduated from the University of Adelaide in 1975 with a PhD in clinical psychology. He's currently an emeritus professor in the Australian National University's College of Medicine, Biology and Environment. He was previously Professor of Clinical Psychology and Head of the Department of Psychology and Director of the School of Health and Psychological Sciences at ANU. His research is focused on the roles of stress and behaviour in mediating risk of cardiovascular disease. occupational stress, and the psychological determinants and prevention of adolescent smoking behaviour. Don's past president of the International College of Psychosomatic Medicine and a member of the National Committee on Psychology of the Australian Academy of Science, and also a member of the Professional Development and Accreditation Advisory Group of the Australian Psychological Society. I don't know if there's any other accomplishments or roles that you want to let us know of, or you just want to sit there and feel tired contemplating that list. So, look, it gives me great pleasure to invite Don up. And what I thought we'd do is, Don will do a presentation, and then for questions, if Marlies would like to join Don up here, to answer any questions and take part in that discussion. Good, thank you, Don.
Thanks, Alan, and thank you for the invitation to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming. Winter in Melbourne is just as challenging as winter in Canberra, so to come out on a winter's night to hear about the Handbook of Psychocardiology is an honour that Elise and I appreciate. In a sense, this is a book launch. We had hoped that there would be copies of the book here in front of you. Unfortunately, the printers didn't quite share that goal, and it's somewhere in the printing process, and with luck it'll be out in a couple of weeks' time. So one or two of the things that I'm going to say in a little while are grossly inaccurate, and I'll apologise for them at the time. But it is on the way, and we hope to see it quite soon. What I really want to do is to lead you in a sort of storytelling way through why we thought a book like this was necessary, ultimately why Springer agreed with us and agreed to publish the book, what our objectives were, and what the process was. I'm sure that some of you here tonight have edited books, and so you know the agonies, the nightmares that we went through over the process of getting this up and running. And we'll share some of those agonies and nightmares with you. But tonight is really a celebration because the agonies and nightmares are all out of the way, and we will in a very short space of time have copies available. Now, I'll just grab this little bit of instrumentation. Hope it works for me. It does. That's wonderful. So, a Handbook of Psychocardiology. Everything has to have a beginning. And there's our beginning. It all started there. That's a little city about 30 kilometres north of Florence, and it's called Prato. And Italy has given rise to, or inspiration for many, many things, but we can say quite truly that the beautiful city of Prato gave inspiration for the Handbook of Psychocardiology. Perhaps a little more accurately, that was the place where the inspiration came from. And as you'll see, Monash University is quite well, quite prominent in that street. It's said, incidentally, because you'll note that it's been raining there, that the only street that it actually rains in Prato is the street which has the Monash label attached to it. Everything else is bright and sunny. But Monash has a small conference centre in Prato, and it's a most wonderful place for a conference to be held. It's in an old palazzo that came into Monash's possession through means that I am not familiar with, but it's a really great place to have a conference. We also had some discussions there. That's the Villa La Ferdinanda, an old Medici villa just out of Prato, up in the hills overlooking both Prato and Florence. And that's where the conference dinner was, way back in 2008. I'll come back to the conference in a minute. So we had some conversations there too. You can probably see Melissa's table. I think it was that little one there. But and when I say if the entertainment allowed it, I'm quite serious, because we either had a singer of grand opera, or was it a string quartet at one stage or another?
Also had a tenor.
And a tenor, that's right, yes. It wasn't Pavarotti or Bocelli, but he was good. He was good. So we had some discussions there as well. And there was a lot of input from that place. Now that will be familiar to many of you. That's the Baker IDI Heart and Diabetes Research Institute building over near the Alfred Hospital. The people at the Baker were quite instrumental in getting all of this to come together, to happen. Not so much the handbook, but the event that gave birth to the idea, which turned ultimately into the handbook. That was the event. Some of you might have been at it. Were any of you there in 2008 at the first Heart and Mind Psychogenic Cardiovascular Disease Conference? No. Okay. Well, the event that gave all of this its initial impetus was that small meeting in Prato in September 2008. Small, about 150, 160 people, a rather diverse audience or group of participants, cardiologists obviously, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, some general practitioners. It's fascinating that at the opening reception I ran into my wife's general practitioner who'd come up from Canberra to go to the meeting. So it was a diverse body of individuals. But it was 3 days of concentrated presentations on virtually every aspect of psychocardiology that you can imagine, from epidemiology through to the psychobiological links between psychological factors and cardiovascular disease, through to issues of management and so on. No particular structure. I guess the structure sorted itself out in a manner by the nature of the presentations that were offered and accepted. But it was 3 of the most magnificent days of knowledge, of information sharing, of discussion, and of acknowledgement that there is an area called psychocardiology. It's not just cardiology, it's not just what the cardiologists do, nor is it just psychology and psychiatry. It's not what most of us here do, but there's a link between the two, and that link was acknowledged, I think, in a formal way, certainly at that conference, probably in other forums as well. But it was a really good way of acknowledging that the link exists, and that it was something that we needed to explore. There were 2 crucial people in putting that event together. There they are. One of them's sitting over there, Melissa Alberinga. The other one, I'm sure many of you will know, is Murray Esler from the Baker. And the conference was, I think, the brainchild of Melissa and Murray. I might even have had a little input into it myself, sort of saying, hey guys, why don't we have a conference? But I just realised that I said something terrible. I used the guy's word. And we're not allowed to do that anymore. Anyway, these 2 interested and devoted people were quite instrumental in bringing about that first event, that 2008 Heart and Mind conference in Prato. And that's where it all started. That's where the ideas first began. That's where they began to evolve. And without the Prato meeting, I'm not sure that a book like the Handbook of Psychocardiology would have come into being. And so I'm grateful to both of those two people and to others in that original team who invited me to be part of that meeting and to participate in what was probably the inaugural event that brought together people from a wide diversity of disciplines and professional backgrounds to talk about the single unifying feature of those backgrounds, and that was the role of psychological factors in cardiovascular disease. So after Prato, 2008, what happened? Well, the papers, or at least some of them that were presented in 2008 were published in a special issue of Stress and Health. Again, they were a diversity of papers, not a whole lot of logical organisation involved, except that they all had to do with the links between psychological factors and cardiovascular disease. But nonetheless, a special issue of Stress and Health, edited by the then editor of the journal, Graham Burrows, who was also at the conference. There were two other Prato meetings that followed, one in 2010 and the last one in 2012. Marlies and I were both at each of those meetings, and there was a significant but not complete commonality between participants for the meetings. We saw familiar faces, we saw familiar keynote speakers, but we saw new people as well coming in. And then, unfortunately, for a whole variety of reasons, 2012 was the last year of the Prato conference. That was sad. It's something that we worked on to try and reinvigorate, but I guess the will just wasn't there. But nonetheless, 3 meetings over 4 years, every 2 years, was a good way to start it all off. Now, I remember sitting one night in an Italian restaurant in Canberra with Marlies, because she'd been in my school doing a workshop for the day, and I'd thought to myself, you know, at one stage or another we really should think about putting all of this wisdom and knowledge and practical information into a book form. You know, at least we could get a lot of the speakers from the Prato meeting to come together and contribute chapters and so on. And we sat in this little Italian restaurant called Bella Vista, and almost simultaneously we said to each other, why don't we do a book? And that was, what, about 2012, something like that. But the idea came then, and there were a lot of planning and discussion meetings between then and finally putting the whole thing together. It was interrupted a little bit by a knee reconstruction. It wasn't mine, but once that got out of the way and a friend of mine was back on her feet again, the book started to take shape. And then there was a chance encounter. I think a lot of books involve something of chance encounters, but I was asked to see a group of people from Springer who were visiting my school, ostensibly for them to ask, do any of your staff members have books that they might want to consider proposing? And I put them in the direction of 2 or 3 other people, and then I said just in passing, incidentally, you know, we've got this idea for a book on psychocardiology, and the commissioning editor jumped up and said, we'll take it. I said, but hang on, I haven't told you about it yet. She said, well, you can tell us about it, but we'll take it. And so that produced a level of formality about the book, and from then on it became a partnership with Springer. And I have to say that they've been a fantastic publisher to work with. They've really been a joy, and a completely professional group of people. We were so lucky and so pleased that we had them. What happened then? Again, you know, some of you may well have edited books and so you'll know the process, but it needed a formal proposal which we wrote. We sent that off to Springer. It was peer reviewed, quite obviously. It went off to a number of learned authorities around the world. We weren't supposed to know who they were, but of course we did. And we were pleased with the reviews that we got. Not only were they complimentary, not only were they encouraging, not so much to us, but to Springer, to put a book like this into the market. But they also contained a number of very good suggestions as to where we ought to be going. The initial proposal, I think, had about 35 chapters in it. And from those suggestions and from other ideas, it grew to what it is today. In fact, it grew to an even greater level, but I'll tell you why it contracted just a little bit in a moment or two. But the number of chapters virtually doubled. Every time Melissa and I would meet up, we'd say to each other, we really should have a chapter on, or I just read this really fantastic paper, and we ought to get that person to write a chapter. So it did grow. It wasn't a fixed entity when we first gave the proposal to Springer. We signed a contract in mid-2013, which said that we'd deliver a manuscript in mid-2014. And virtually 30 seconds after signing it, I went into a state of panic and thought, my God, there is no way in the world we are going to put together a book of that magnitude in a year. I must have been living in a fool's paradise. So I summoned up courage and got in touch with Springer and said, well, I know we've signed a contract and you might want to sue me, but can we please have another year? And of course they, being much more experienced, I'd edited 4 or 5 books before, but can't say that I was particularly experienced. Springer got back and said, look, we know you weren't going to put it together in a year, so put together the best book that you can, and when it comes together, send it to us, and that's fine. And so again, we're grateful enormously to Springer for their encouragement and their patience, because it did take the best part of 2 years to put together, as I'm sure you can imagine. So 2 years of frantic work, and when I say frantic, I mean that quite literally sometimes. It was hard work. If you're contemplating editing a book at the moment, come and talk to us, and we'll probably try and talk you out of it. But it is a hard job. I must have run up enormous bills for my school in phone calls and emails. Well, emails aren't so bad, but international phone calls talking to contributors and so on and so forth. But virtually every day there was at least one instance of a need to have a long phone call or send off a long email to keep our contributors as energised and enthusiastic as we were. Our anxiety levels sometimes approached clinical proportions, I'm sure. I remember probably about 14 months ago when things were looking bleak, and Elise and I had a meeting here in Melbourne and a few frantic phone calls to Springer in Singapore, because we were quite sure that they were going to cancel the contract, and then when we couldn't get hold of them, we became even more anxious. But it is an anxiety-provoking activity, putting something like this together. Finally, in about the second half of last year, we had a critical mass of chapters. By critical mass, I think, it was into the 50s. 50 or more chapters. Not all of the chapters that had been promised, but amass enough to know that we could go to press with a book that would make sense, that would have some level of logic to its organisation, and that if all else failed, at least we could publish that. But we still had some chapters that were outstanding. And so, again, some frantic phone calls, threats, pleas. I think I suggested to Melise at one stage or another that she should shed tears when she spoke to one or two people whose responsibility she had for getting the chapter up and running. I don't know whether that happened or not, but it seemed like a good ploy at the time. But almost inevitably, the last half dozen chapters are the most difficult to get. I'll come back to why we missed out on some of the chapters in a little while. But we got them. They were coming in sequentially. There was proofreading and editing, so that we needed to go through each of the chapters very carefully. Not that, of course, we were going to second guess the wisdom, the scientific knowledge of our contributors. But what we did want was to make sure that the style was consistent, and that a reader could start off at chapter 1 and get through to chapter 60 and know that they were reading the same book, and not a lot of relatively unrelated essays on a loosely similar topic. So there was that. At the end of last year, about a week before Christmas, the editor said, well, we've got the proofs, and you have to proofread them and get us your comments, and we want it by, was it the 1st of January, I think. So there went the Christmas holidays. It was a great time to pick for proofreading, but it happened. Electronic publication occurred in March of 2016. That is, the chapters all became available on the internet, on the Springer Major Reference Works website for people to look at. And then on the 10th of May this year, that's the cover. 2 volumes, 60 chapters and 1,156 pages. So when I mentioned that it was a fairly major work, it is indeed, from a volumetric point of view at least, a major work. We hope from a scientific point of view it's also a major work, but that's for you to judge when you look at it. And as I said earlier, we had hoped that there would be mounds of copies on that front table for you to come and look at and look through. But unfortunately the printers had somewhat different ideas. But that will happen. So, why go to all of this effort? Was it worth the hard slog? I can answer you that one very quickly, I think, from my point of view. And that is to say, yes, it was worth the hard slog. I'm delighted that we got it out and that it's come out in the way that it has. Melise can speak for herself. But yes, I think it was worth all of the effort. Why go to the effort? Well, when we put in the proposal and we looked at what was available in the general area, there were a few books that had been put out that purported to cover the area of psychocardiology or cardiac psychology, or whatever you want to call it. But nothing that we could actually call comprehensive. Nothing that we could put our fingers on and say, yeah, that covers the whole territory, and so we don't have to put this together. And we really wanted to bring together something that was as comprehensive as we possibly could get it, based on a lot of the wisdom that had flown through the Prato conference over the 2008 through 2012 iterations. And for whom? Well, I'll come back to that in a little while, but quite clearly, as you will all know, there's an enormous diversity of people who could claim to practice what we call psychocardiology. Of course, there are psychologists and psychiatrists and cardiologists who adopt a particular orientation to their practice when they deal with patients with cardiovascular disease. But there are a lot of other people as well. When I told my own general practitioner that a couple of years ago that I was putting out a book, and she's already reserved her copy, she was delighted. She said, this is exactly what GPs need. We see so much of it. We see hypertension in general practice. We see rehabilitation after infarction. We see a whole range of things to do with cardiology. And we know that it has a lot to do with depression, and it has a lot to do with stress, and it has a lot to do with anxiety. But we don't have the knowledge. We have no compendium of knowledge that we'd like to have in order to be able to effectively treat our patients with cardiovascular disease over and above the medical treatment that we give them. It's for rehabilitation specialists, I guess, for social workers, for nurses perhaps. I'll come back to that in a little while. So why go to the effort? Well, as I said, it's an effort that we thought was well worth it, because no such volume that we knew of, even though there were excellent books out which covered some of the territory, were as comprehensive as we wanted the coverage to be. Now, psychocardiology is not new. We all know that people have been thinking about the links between cardiovascular disease and psychological factors for hundreds of years. Those links have been acknowledged, they've been written about, they've been speculated about, and there are some famous quotes. William Harvey, these will probably be familiar to you, but every affection of the mind that's attended with either pain or pleasure, hope or fear, is the cause of an agitation whose influence extends to the heart. Very clear. There was a recognition way back then that emotions give rise to manifestations within the heart. Part of the first chapter of the book seeks to look somewhat at how that comes about. John Hunter, the Scottish surgeon. My life is in the hands of any rascal who puts me in passion. And I make that quote because it was prophetic. Hunter himself, as some of you will know, collapsed after a rather angry meeting of the College of Physicians of Glasgow over the admission of medical students to the college, and died of a massive infarction. Hunter fortunately said these prophetic words before he died. I don't think they were his final words, but they were prophetic. And one last one, one that I'm particularly fond of, because for a long time I worked on the area of type A behaviour and collaborated with my very good and now unfortunately late friend Ray Rosenman. But Sir William Osler, the Canadian physician, way back said of the potential victim of a heart attack that it's not the delicate neurotic person, but the robust, the vigorous in mind, the body, the keen and ambitious man, the indicator of whose engine is always at full speed. And he really foreshadowed type A behaviour a long time before Ray and Mike Friedman were even thinking about it. So the idea that there is a link between psychological, psychosocial factors, broadly, very broadly defined, and cardiovascular disease is not at all new. We have a history. So what is new? Well, what's new is that we now have a lot of evidence. In putting up the proposal, I did a very rough and ready search of PubMed. I didn't have time to interrogate PsycInfo. I probably should do that at some stage or another, but looking at a number of search terms, here are the hit rates, the number of publications that we found. There were no time limits, so I didn't search just for the last 10 years or 20 years. I left it unlimited in regard to the vintage of the publication. And of course, this is uncorrected for false positives, and a lot of things that came up in The search may well have had little, if anything, to do with the field of inquiry that we were really interested in, but the sheer numbers give you some indication, even if we correct enormously for false positives, as to what a literature search will find. Close to 55,000 publications, which came up simply with stress and cardiovascular disease. And then they go down somewhat. I guess the one that surprised me a little, because I thought it would be up further, although the evidence is much more recent, is depression and cardiovascular disease. But even then, close to 23,000 hits on that crude, admittedly crude search. And so what that confirmed for us, not that I had any doubts about it, but certainly confirmed for Springer, was that there was now evidence, and that evidence was as yet somewhat untapped. So false positives and overlaps aside, and we absolutely concede that if we did a filter of those hits, they'd reduce considerably. But nonetheless, we're looking at a very impressive body of largely peer-reviewed evidence since PubMed first came into being and was able to be interrogated, that did document links between psychological factors and cardiovascular disease. Did we read it all? I didn't. Did you? No. But we read a lot of it. So from this rich mixture, when we searched for meaning, it reduced to some essential questions. Does psychocardiology have a persuasive documented history? Again, we were trying to prepare a proposal which was going to be persuasive for a publisher to put a fair amount of money into producing a book. Well, is there a persuaded documented history? Our view was that there was no doubt that even searching back in the historical literature, there was enough in the literature to say, yes, there is a rich body of evidence over the course of 50 or 60 years which says that a term such as psychocardiology has meaning and delineates an integrated area of inquiry and of clinical practice that's worth looking at. And then the next question, what's the strength of epidemiological evidence linking the mind to the heart? I think we really only need to go to one example there, although there are many, and that's the example of the relationship between depression and acute myocardial infarction. There is now such unequivocal epidemiological evidence that depression is a major risk factor for acute MI that there is no doubt, I think, in the mind of any clear-thinking person that what we have there is good, persuasive evidence. But the same can be said for anxiety states, particularly things like post-traumatic stress disorder and panic disorder, and for a whole lot of other psychological entities as well. And the final question, because it's one that is often asked by our hard-nosed cardiological friends, well, yes, you've got a correlation, and that's lovely, that really looks good, but can you explain the correlation? Is there a plausible psychobiological mechanism which links psychological factors with cardiovascular disease? And the answer again there is yes, and one only has to go to the work of the Baker, for example, and Murray Esler's unit with Gavin Lambert and people like that. But way beyond that, to know that there is now quite enough evidence to establish plausible psychobiological mechanisms, that we're looking at something that can start to take on the character of causality. Now, being a research psychologist and being a very cautious one, I'm always extremely cautious in talking about causality. But I think in the area of psychocardiology, we are now approaching the point where we can start to be a little more confident in making causal claims for things like depression in regard to some manifestations of cardiovascular disease. So if the evidence was convincing, and we thought it was, some more questions. And all of this goes, of course, to the organisation of the book. What within the domain of psychology, broadly speaking, I include obviously the very closely related domain of psychiatry there, but what within that broad domain constitutes the strongest risk for cardiovascular disease? Many would probably say at the moment it's depression, but I think it goes beyond that now. I think the evidence is accumulating. Can this evidence be used in the management of those with established and manifest cardiovascular disease? Again, we see cardiological clinics all over the place starting to involve the work of clinical psychologists and psychiatrists and others of like mind in the management of patients with existing cardiovascular disease. So I don't think that there's any doubt about that. And perhaps the one that's most slightly contentious, because I think the evidence still has to accumulate. There's some evidence, but it involves the big epidemiological studies that we have yet to do. But can it also be used for the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease? I think many of us would say yes, and I think the work of this particular group, Alan's group, is focused to a large extent on primary prevention. But does behaviour change bring about a preventive influence for cardiovascular disease? I have no doubt that the answer to that is yes. But the big studies are probably still being done. I'll come back in 5 years and hopefully be able to tell you that I've got a whole lot more on literature searches, and the evidence is in and it's home and hosed. So we have those broad questions in mind when we put together the structure of the book. And they became pivotal to informing us as to how we should select chapters, invite contributions, and put the ultimate structure of the Handbook of Psychocardiology into place. And so it came out something like this. Section 1, Volume 1. And as I said, I had hoped that we would have had copies here to show you, but I've managed to print off something from the proof so I can tell you a little bit about it. History and foundations. What have we got in the section on history and foundations? You've probably got an overview of it there in the little brochures that we quickly, or that our publishers have quickly put together. But a couple of chapters on the history of psychocardiology, an important chapter on fundamentals of cardiology for the non-cardiologist, because a lot of people who we hope will read this book, even though they might be medically trained, are not necessarily as familiar with modern concepts in cardiology as they would want to be, and certainly clinical psychologists aren't. So we thought we really needed a chapter which allowed us all to familiarise ourselves with the cardiological side of the equation. Some chapters on epidemiology, on lifestyle in relation to cardiovascular risk, and then some chapters on a couple of the very basic behavioural risk factors for cardiovascular disease, smoking and alcohol. And there are probably more, and there are more that we can put in the second edition, and we would love to have your ideas on that, because as I'll say again in a little while, it's an evolving work, it's a work in progress, continual progress, and we'll add new chapters as they come up. And then a very large section on stress, psychopathology and cardiovascular disease. Stress is the obvious one. Psychopathology in terms of depression and anxiety particularly, but psychoses, various kinds of stress, occupational stress, a long-standing interest of mine. Psychogenic hypertension, stress, cardiomyopathy, and so on and so forth. So that's probably the meatiest and most major section of the book. And it took us 24 chapters, and I think we could probably have more covering that territory to the extent that we wanted covered. And we looked at psychopathology as something quite different from personality and aspects of the social environment. So another section, 7 chapters, overlapping a bit with the previous section, but personality, the psychosocial environment, and cardiovascular disease. Things like type A behaviour, anger and hostility, gender differences, important, social support, mental health and cardiovascular disease in refugees, and Harry Menas, who wrote that wonderful chapter, is sitting there with us. And becoming more important as the world becomes inundated with people who've been displaced for reasons not of their own making. Exceptionally important. Social disadvantage. Something again that epidemiologists, not just behavioural epidemiologists, but epidemiologists generally, are looking at with greater and greater interest, because society is not as kind to every member as it is to every other member. And there are people who live under conditions, even in our own society, of significant disadvantage, of financial disadvantage, of lack of social resources and so on. And so social disadvantage and cardiovascular risk. And then the one that, as I said, people kept asking, if you can come up with epidemiological clinical evidence, how do you know through what mechanisms does it really link to cardiovascular disease? And so we went to the experts there. A lot of this material, I have to say, defeats me. I read a couple of pages of the chapter on epigenetics, or one of the chapters on epigenetics, and got so totally lost that I thought, well, this looks really good. And it came from an absolute expert in the field, and so I thought, well, it is really good. But God, I wish I could understand it. But a lot of work on the sympathetic nervous system, sympathetic nervous activity, gene and environment interactions, diabetes, depression, and cardiovascular risk, insulin resistance, animal models, and then a final chapter there, which I think both Elise and I tried to read, and we got probably to the first page, and that's a chapter on data analysis in all of these things, the mathematical analysis of data in cardiovascular epidemiology and cardiovascular physiology, written by a dear friend of mine, Robert Gregson, now 87 years old, and he's just published his 9th book, but an expert in nonlinear dynamic analyses of continuous data. And we got to the first page, and that was it. But I know him, so I know it's good. Psychological management of patients with cardiovascular disease. Alan and Barbara contributed to this section, 8 chapters with a somewhat greater clinical focus, and a very important focus, because as clinicians, and I think most of you are, and I was at one stage or another when I had time, knowing what the evidence is. We like to think that we do use psychocardiology in our clinical practices. Well, these chapters give us some evidential basis for that. Lifestyle management in cardiovascular disease, prevention and secondary intervention. Some chapters on lifestyle, changing lifestyle behaviours, physical activity, obesity and its relationship with CVD. And finally, summing up. And that was a chapter that Melissa and I put together, but we couldn't write it until everybody else's chapters were in, because you can't sum up what hasn't been written. But we summed it up, and we think it's a reasonable summation. Our contributors, well, quite clearly the best in their fields. And I say that with no tongue-in-cheek whatsoever. We went to the best, and by and large we got them. We went to some of the people who were, so far up in the heavens that we hardly dared approach them, and we got some knockbacks, but that was okay, because there were always people who were just as good, who were happy to write chapters. So I personally think that our list of contributors is as outstanding a group of clinicians and scientists as we could possibly hope to have got, and we are tremendously grateful for the effort and the contribution that they've put into bringing this handbook to where it is. Did we miss out on areas? We think so. Cerebrovascular disease, it's not central to cardiovascular disease, but a lot of the basic elements are the same. We hope to have a chapter, but we got let down, unfortunately. So ultimately we didn't. Parasympathetic influences, we had an expert at the University of London teed up to write this, and then unfortunately he developed cancer and couldn't. But that's certainly a chapter for the next edition. Behavioural economics, tried hard there. That's a story in itself. But again, a very interesting story to tell, and we'll try that one again for the next edition. Translational medicine, the translation of the evidence to practice. Again, a story in itself. We had an expert lined up, eventually he didn't produce, but we'll look around more. Other areas, well, as I said, suggestions that any of you have are enormously welcome. I mean, if any of you want to write chapters on any of those areas or anything else that hasn't been covered, tell us and we'll look at those suggestions very, very carefully. So the Handbook of Psychocardiology is a work in constant evolution. Springer has a constantly updatable website for authors. They can update their chapters if they so want, or we can add new chapters. And when there's a critical mass, then we can bring out a new hard copy of the book. That probably won't happen for a couple of years, but nonetheless the electronic version will be updatable. So I said this a couple of days ago, and I was much more persuaded that it would be available. It is, and it can be ordered if you want, or not. But we hope that it will be on the bookshelves of every airport in Australia and around the world in the next few weeks. So thank you for listening to that small story. I think, as I said, it gives us some level of encouragement that there was a reason for putting the book together, and that I think by and large we got it right. But we're not going to make that judgment until we start getting some reviews. And I don't mind whether they're informal reviews, whether you look through the book and you think, this is really great, please tell us. You think, this is okay, but it needs boosting in some other areas, please tell us. And if you think, this is the worst thing I've read since, well, I'm trying to think of the last worst thing I read, but we want to know that too. So again, thank you for coming, thank you for listening. And Melissa and I would be delighted to answer any questions that you might have or not. So would you like to come on?
Good, so we've got a mic. Some people need a mic. Some of us were trained not to need microphones. But if you're asking a question, just say who you are, and what would be good to know too is like your disciplinary background. So, because it helps people understand where you're coming from in terms of questions.
Yes, at the back.
Hello, Len Gould. I've been working in cardiac psychology for 20 years since I had a bypass operation myself. And so I've been working in rehab in Melbourne and now in the Ballarat. I have a website and a number of other things. The thing that I'm curious about when I looked at your book, in fact, when I left tonight, I said to my wife, I might buy a copy. But when I saw the price, I thought, don't think so. But I'm wondering why a book today with so much information, why isn't it a database, or so you can pick out the things that are important to you and leave the rest? There must have been a decision with Springer and yourselves when you decided to go for hard copy, which was such a volume of work. I would have thought it will be very hard to maintain, publish, distribute, and of course pay for. Yeah.
No, that's a very good question. We had very little to do with the way the publishers decided to put it together. But the intention, so far as I understand it, is that the hard copy will be a rather minor part of the whole publication process. The electronic copy will be a more major part, and I believe, but don't quote me on it yet, that Springer has an idea that particular chapters can be downloaded at a particular cost. I don't know what it's going to be, in ways which interest individual people. So I think what's going to happen once the material gets out on the Springer website is that you'll find that you can get access to parts of the book without having to purchase the whole lot. But the hard copy is not, I think, in the views of most publishers nowadays, the most prominent form of publication.
Although I will say that I am old-fashioned, and I think just having a book and being able to touch it and smell it, and I think is fantastic.
That's because we edited it.
That's probably it.
And I think there's a lot of people who enjoy the smell of a new book. Smelling computer screens isn't quite the same. They also look rather ridiculous as well.
But if it was in a format online, you could say this is for nurses, this is for social workers. You could classify it in ways where you pick out what's relevant. You spend $600 on a book for...
You could pick out what's relevant, I agree, but that would be, for me anyway, making decisions for professionals that I have no right to make. A nurse might want to read the chapters on epigenetics, for example, and understand them better than I do. So I think having a free choice is better than to predetermine a set of structures aimed at particular individuals. As I said, I would not personally want to make that decision for other people because I don't think it's my right to do that.
I have...
Hi, just Don, for the invitation for other suggestions for additions to this, I think the research in this area is complex, and the identifying what are the core questions and what might be a kind of a psychocardiology research agenda to advance the field seems to me to be something that would find a really strong place in something like this. And that's true for most areas which are interdisciplinary, where you're trying to bring together not only different perspectives, but different research methods, different approaches, different kinds of... so that would be, I think, something that would be very welcome to a whole lot of people that are interested in the field.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that, Harry. Yes, I definitely concur with you, and I think it's an area that I'm not sure if you would like to make that contribution or make a suggestion as to who can, of course.
But what I would like, Harry, if you could, is to just drop us a quick email on that. And indeed, anybody who has suggestions, just send us an email, and we'd love to get that. But if you can just drop me a line or two. Thank you.
That issue of actually setting a research agenda is an important one. The Australian Cardiovascular Rehabilitation and Health Association is currently looking at developing a research agenda in that particular field. And I know the nurses have done it and published cardiac nursing in Europe on developing a research agenda. One of the challenges, of course, is the very diversity of the field, isn't it? The fact that it is multidisciplinary, it's
Yep.
spread all over the world. There's no central organisation that would actually drive. There's no college. There's, you know, although in the US, of course, you know, there's moves to have this declared a recognised specialty in cardiology, but there's no central organisational driver, which is a major challenge. So it would be great if we could think about how we might harness that and put some sort of organisation around an attempt to develop an agenda. Yeah.
I had a question. From a clinical point of view, I was wondering, given that cardiology largely operates in a medical model, and you guys have such a comprehensive overview of the field now, what are your thoughts on the challenges of bringing psychology and psychiatry to the medical model?
I thank you for that question. I think it's an excellent question. I will say that perhaps in keeping with the theme of storytelling, very, very long time ago when I was starting to do my studies in psychology, and I wanted to do my thesis in psychology, I was very drawn to the area of psychosomatic research. And it was around that time that I had the great fortune of meeting a very psychologically minded cardiologist. And that was, of course, Professor Mary Esler. And that's how I came to be part of the Baker IDI. But it was a very interesting learning experience in being a psychologist, especially back in those days. In cardiology, nobody understood what I was there for. Somebody once tried to give me a stethoscope. I'm like, no, I don't need this one. It was fascinating, and but I did get to learn a lot. And it was a fabulous experience to being a psychologist in a cardiology setting. And it became apparent to me that although we might be very different disciplines, we do have a lot in common and where we can actually help one another. I did notice going around the wards that there were many people with cardiac problems who were emotionally distressed, or people who were not adhering to their medications, or people who bluntly refused to undergo procedures that would save their lives, and there was no explanation, and cardiologists didn't quite know what to do with these people. And so this is where I started to kind of do some work along those areas. Then, of course, I met Rosemary Schwartz, who's a psychiatrist, and she also shared a passion for cardiology, perhaps because her husband is a cardiologist. And the journey has been an interesting one to appreciate. I mean, now I'm actually a consultant clinical psychologist for Monash Heart at Monash Medical Center. And unfortunately, more of my colleagues couldn't be here tonight, but there's various reasons for that. They're all doing catheter studies, coincidentally. And it's been very interesting again, because they didn't quite know what to make of me when I first came on board. But I do find that education is actually a large aspect of this, being able to communicate to them, this is what we can do, and this is the sort of things that we can offer. And of course, for myself, I think I'm learning a lot more about what they do, and how they could also help me in terms of our patients. And look, it's all very much very slow work, and I do think that is us all, getting to know each other still. But I think that books like this, works like this, to help to bridge that gap, and to initiate a conversation, and to make us not feel like we are strangers, but rather colleagues, and perhaps collaborators as well. Not sure if you have anything else to add.
No, look, I'd agree with that. It's just like the book, it's a process in evolution, and it will happen. I first got into the area probably 35 years ago, when it was very difficult for me to gain access to patients with cardiovascular disease, because initially I was doing clinical studies. It took one very prominent and vocal cardiologist to break that barrier, but there was a lot of suspicion. As I mentioned earlier, I had the privilege, again earlier in my career, to work with Ray Rosenman, a cardiologist who is probably one of the parents of psychocardiology through his work in type A behaviour. Ray would tell me the same story. He was often more accepted by psychiatrists and psychologists than he was by his cardiological colleagues. But it's changed. 35 years ago it was exceptionally difficult. Now it's not. I think that was one of the bits of magic about the Prato conference, that people actually came together and started to talk about common ground. And what we've tried to do, as I said, is to try and put some of that common ground into print on paper or print on an electronic screen or whatever. And it will happen, but it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Good.
Any more questions? Or anyone want to add to those points?
Well, if there's no more questions, I just would like to add from my point of view here, what an incredibly joyful experience it's been for me to collaborate with Don on this. And I can honestly say, if it weren't for him, I don't think you will see that book up there. He has been not just an incredible colleague, but also very much he has taught me a lot in terms of this process of putting a book together and the sort of things that we need to keep in mind. And I have also learned a lot about being a politician, a counsellor, a diplomat, and all kinds of things in between. Indeed, we have had some very interesting adventures on this journey, and for my part, it has been an incredibly rewarding experience and a very joyful sport to work with you. It's a fantastic experience for me.
Good, thank you.
Thank you all
So
for
can we
coming.
thank
Yes.
Don and take some refreshments?
Yeah, to
and-
close the meeting, we just firstly want to announce that we do have a meeting coming up in September. We're just still confirming the dates yet, but the topic will be psychosis and heart disease. And in November, we're hoping to run another meeting on childhood heart disease and congenital heart disease. And so, yeah, please join us for refreshments courtesy of Springer.